My brother made everyone close their eyes when speaking to him because he believed eye contact would drain his life force. When our parents left us alone for a week, he locked me in my room and explained he'd found the perfect solution to my disobedience. He'd bought medical supplies online and studied anatomy diagrams to surgically remove my eyes so I could never look at anyone again. When did your demanding sibling go from bad to worse? My brother required everyone to keep their eyes closed when speaking to him because he believed direct eye contact would drain his life force, so I had to navigate our house blind whenever he was around or he'd lock me in the basement. Ethan had always been weird about personal connections. He wouldn't hug anyone, not even our parents. He ate meals in his room because watching people chew disgusted him. When he turned 14, he read some new age book about energy vampires and became obsessed with the idea that eye contact was how people stole each other's spiritual essence. He started wearing sunglasses indoors, then progressed to demanding everyone else look away when he entered a room. When I was 12 and he was 16, he discovered some online forum about psychic protection and decided that being looked at was literally culling him. Ethan called a family meeting to announce his new rule. No one could look directly at him anymore. We had to close our eyes when speaking to him, avert our gaze when passing in hallways, and never make eye contact even accidentally. Looking at him was stealing his soul energy. He'd printed laminated cards showing proper, non-viewing protocols. Mom tried to reason with him, but Ethan screamed that she was murdering him with her eyes. He wouldn't stop until she agreed. Dad gave in immediately. They thought it was just another weird phase, but Ethan was deadly serious about protecting his spiritual essence. Living with Ethan's rule was immediately exhausting. Every interaction required careful choreography. I'd have to announce myself before entering rooms, wait for him to position himself, then navigate with my eyes shut. If I accidentally glanced at him, he'd collapse dramatically, claiming I'd drained his energy. He installed mirrors at angles so he could see us without us seeing him. Our parents enabled it completely, teaching themselves to cook and clean with closed eyes whenever he was present. It's just better than the drama, my mom said, as if this wasn't its own kind of unbearable drama, and if I ever slipped up or flat out refused to comply, the punishment was swift. He started demanding energy repayment through bizarre rituals. One accidental glance meant sitting in a circle of salt while he chanted for hours. He installed motion sensors that screamed when someone entered his space without their eyes closed. 3 viewings in one day meant being locked in the coat closet until you'd written essays about respecting bodily autonomy. He'd test us constantly, jumping out to see if we'd instinctively look at him. It infected every aspect of my life. Friends stopped coming over because he'd accused them of psychic assault for looking at him. He got teachers to let him sit facing the wall, claiming forward-facing seats exposed him to energy theft. Every interaction became a blindfolded performance where one reflexive glance meant hours of punishment. When I was in 10th grade, I started dating Noah and decided I wasn't going to let Ethan corrupt this one normal thing. At Noah's house, I could see freely, and it felt like escaping prison. When Noah came to dinner, I warned him about the rules, but muscle memory is hard to break. He glanced at Ethan while passing the potatoes. The explosion was instant. Ethan clutched his chest, screaming about his life force draining while Noah stared in shock. I grabbed Noah and left, telling Ethan I was done with his insane demands. For 2 weeks, I looked at Ethan every chance I got. Direct stares during breakfast, eye contact in hallways. He'd shriek about soul murder, collapse on the floor, demand energy repayments, but I kept looking. I thought if I held firm, he'd realize how ridiculous this was. Our parents begged me to comply, but I refused. I was done stumbling blind through my own home. Ethan lost his mind when I kept making eye contact. He started wearing a helmet with curtains, carrying a fog machine to obscure himself. He convinced our parents I was deliberately trying to cull him with my gaze. They started punishing me for his meltdowns, taking my phone when I looked at him, grounding me for accidental glances. Meanwhile, he escalated to physical barriers. He built elaborate blinds and screens, turning our house into a maze where seeing him was impossible. He installed cameras to catch me looking at him, creating compilation videos of my attacks with dramatic music. He made our parents put locks on my eyelids while I slept, so I couldn't steal his energy unconsciously. He hired other energy believers to follow me, ensuring I never looked in his direction. When that wasn't enough, he started wearing mirrors on his clothes, claiming if I saw his reflection, I'd see myself stealing his soul and feel guilty enough to stop. Then our parents went out of town for a week, leaving me and Ethan alone, and it turned out this was the opportunity he'd been waiting for. He barricaded me in my room and explained he had a solution for my ongoing disobedience. He'd researched medieval punishments for witches who stole souls through evil eyes. He'd found the answer in an old text about preventing future sight crimes. You just remove the person's eyes. As he explained the procedure, calmly smiling with his eyes on my floor, I realized how completely screwed I was. He was bigger than me, stronger than me, and had me completely trapped, and he was going to remove my eyes. He was done trying to change my behavior. He was planning to make sure I could never look at anyone again. I knew I had to act fast. My hands were already searching for my phone, but of course he'd taken it. The window was my next thought, but Ethan had anticipated that too. Heavy boards covered it from the outside, screwed in tight. I could hear him moving around downstairs, probably gathering whatever twisted supplies he thought he needed. My door handle rattled. He'd locked it from the outside, but I could hear him testing it, making sure I was secure. I pressed my ear against the door and heard his footsteps retreating down the hall. This was my chance. I grabbed my desk chair and slammed it against the window boards. They didn't budge. The noise brought him running back. He spoke through the door, his voice eerily calm. He explained that he'd been planning this for months. The basement was prepared with restraints. He'd studied anatomy diagrams. He'd even bought medical supplies online. All he needed was for our parents to leave us alone, and now they had. I searched my room frantically. No weapons, nothing sharp enough to break through boards. My laptop was gone, my phone was gone. He'd been thorough. But then I remembered the heating vent. It connected to the hallway. If I could unscrew it, maybe I could crawl through. Working quietly, I used a pen to turn the screws. My fingers shook as I heard him dragging something heavy up the stairs. The vent cover came loose just as his footsteps stopped outside my door. I dove for the opening, squeezing my shoulders through. The metal edges cut into my skin, but I kept pushing forward. The vent was tighter than I'd hoped. I could barely move, inching along on my elbows. Dust filled my lungs. Behind me, I heard my bedroom door crash open. Ethan's muffled shout echoed through the metal tunnel. He knew exactly where I'd gone. I reached a junction where the vent branched off. Left led toward the bathroom, right toward the stairs. I went right, moving faster now despite the cramped space. My knees scraped against rough metal. Sweat dripped into my eyes. Behind me, I could hear Ethan's voice getting closer. He was following me through the vents. The vent ended at another grate overlooking the stairway. I kicked at it desperately. It wouldn't budge. Ethan's breathing echoed closer. In desperation, I turned my body and kicked with both feet. The grate flew off, clattering down the stairs. I tumbled out after it, landing hard on the carpet. I scrambled to my feet and ran for the front door. Locked, with a padlock I'd never seen before. The windows in the living room were boarded too. Even the small window in the bathroom had been covered. He'd turned our house into a prison while I'd slept. Ethan appeared at the top of the stairs, still wearing those ridiculous sunglasses even though he wouldn't look at me. He moved slowly, confidently. He knew I had nowhere to go. He started explaining again, as if this was all perfectly reasonable. My defiance had forced his hand. This was the only way to protect his life force permanently. I backed into the kitchen, grabbing a knife from the drawer. My hands shook as I pointed it at him. He actually laughed. He reminded me that violence would only prove I was dangerous. Besides, he was bigger, stronger. We both knew how this would end, but I wasn't planning to fight him. Instead, I turned the knife on myself, pressing it against my wrist. His confident expression faltered. If he came closer, I told him I'd do it. Then he'd have to explain to our parents why I was bleeding out. His whole careful plan would fall apart. He stopped moving, calculating. We stood frozen, him at the kitchen entrance, me backed against the counter. The house felt impossibly quiet. Even the refrigerator's hum seemed muted. Time stretched between us like a taut wire. Finally, he suggested a compromise. If I put down the knife, he'd give me one chance to convince him there was another way. One conversation, with rules. I had to sit in the circle of salt he'd draw. I had to keep my eyes closed the entire time. If I could prove I understood the damage I'd caused, maybe we could find an alternative solution. I knew it was a trap, but what choice did I have? I set the knife on the counter, keeping it within reach. He produced a container of salt from his pocket, already prepared. As he drew the circle on the kitchen floor, I noticed how his hands shook slightly. Despite his calm voice, he was nervous too. I wonder what really made Ethan snap into believing eye contact could drain his life force. There's something oddly specific about how he progressed from just being antisocial to creating this whole elaborate system with laminated cards and motion sensors and salt circles. I sat in the circle, closing my eyes as instructed. He positioned himself across from me, just outside the salt barrier. Then he began his interrogation. Did I understand that eye contact was a form of assault? Did I comprehend how much pain I'd caused him? Could I grasp the concept of consensual energy exchange? I played along, giving him the answers he wanted. Yes, I understood. Yes, I was sorry. Yes, I would respect his boundaries. But he wasn't satisfied. He could tell I was lying, just saying what he wanted to hear. He needed genuine understanding, genuine remorse. Otherwise, the original plan would proceed. That's when I realized something crucial. All his power came from his delusions. If I could twist those delusions, use them against him, maybe I could turn the tables. I kept my eyes closed, but changed my approach. Instead of apologizing, I started talking about my own energy, how his constant surveillance and punishments had drained me, how his fear had created a psychic vacuum that was culling my spirit. He went quiet. This wasn't the script he'd expected. I continued, building on his own logic. Every time he punished me, he was stealing my life force. Every locked door, every forced blindfold, every circle of salt, they all siphoned my energy to feed his paranoia. He wasn't protecting himself. He was the real energy vampire. His breathing changed. I could hear him shifting uncomfortably. I pressed on, describing how weak I felt, how his rules had dimmed my inner light. I talked about the friends I'd lost, the normal light he'd stolen. I painted myself as the victim of his psychic attacks, using all his own terminology against him. When I finally stopped talking, the kitchen was silent. Then I heard something unexpected. He was crying, quiet, confused sobs. The possibility that he might be the monster in his own mythology had shattered something inside him, but I couldn't celebrate yet. A confused Ethan might be even more dangerous than a confident one. I stayed perfectly still in the salt circle, eyes closed, waiting. His crying gradually stopped. When he spoke again, his voice was different, uncertain. He asked if I really felt drained, if his protections had actually hurt me. The foundation of his worldview was cracking, but I had to be careful not to push too hard too fast. I told him we were both victims of the energy imbalance in our house. Neither of us was safe. The only solution was to create proper boundaries that protected both our life forces. Physical distance, separate spaces, mutual respect for each other's energy fields. I was speaking his language now, and he was listening. He agreed to think about it. But first, I had to prove my commitment to energy balance. I had to stay in the salt circle with my eyes closed for 1 hour while he meditated on the situation. If I opened my eyes even once, the original plan was back on. I agreed, knowing I had no choice. That hour felt like a lifetime. I heard him moving around the kitchen, then throughout the house. Doors opened and closed. Objects scraped across floors. A few times I sensed him standing right in front of me, testing whether I'd peek, but I kept my eyes squeezed shut, playing his game. When the hour ended, he told me to open my eyes. He was wearing a new contraption, a helmet with mirrors angled in every direction. If I looked at him now, I'd only see myself reflected infinitely. It was his compromise. I could keep my eyes, but I'd never see him directly again. I agreed enthusiastically, praising his creative solution. Inside, I was already planning. Our parents would be home in 5 days. I just had to survive until then, playing along with whatever new rules he invented. Then I could tell them everything. Show them the boarded windows, the locks, his plan to blind me. They'd have to see how dangerous he'd become, but Ethan wasn't done. The mirror helmet was just the beginning. Over the next few hours, he outlined an entire new system of coexistence. The house would be divided into zones. We'd have scheduled movement times. Communication would happen through written notes, never face-to-face. He'd already started installing cameras to monitor compliance. I agreed to everything, still playing the reformed energy thief. He seemed satisfied with my cooperation, but I could see the doubt lingering. He assigned me to the guest room, saying my old room was contaminated with hostile energy. The guest room windows were boarded too, but at least I wasn't locked in. That night, I lay awake planning. 5 days. I had 5 days to either escape or survive until our parents returned. The house was a fortress, but every fortress had weaknesses. I just had to find them while maintaining my act. One slip, one sign that I wasn't truly converted to his energy beliefs, and he'd return to his original plan. The first test of our new arrangement came at dawn. Ethan's elaborate alarm system woke me. A series of chimes indicating my designated movement window had begun. I had exactly 15 minutes to use the bathroom and return to my room before his own schedule started. I stumbled through the hallway, keeping my eyes downcast as instructed, following the tape lines he'd laid out overnight to mark approved pathways. The bathroom revealed more of his preparations. He'd covered every reflective surface with paper, eliminating any chance I might accidentally see him in a mirror. A timer sat on the counter, already counting down my remaining minutes. I noticed he'd removed all the cleaning supplies, probably worried I'd use them as weapons. Even the toilet brush was gone. Back in the guest room, I found a tray of food outside my door. Dry cereal, a banana, a bottle of water. Everything prepackaged, nothing that required cooking or could be turned into a weapon. I ate mechanically while studying the room more carefully in daylight. The boards on the windows were secured from outside with long screws. The closet had been emptied except for a few changes of clothes he'd selected for me. No belts, no scarves, nothing with strings or cords. A notebook lay on the nightstand with detailed instructions for our new communication system. I was to write any requests or needs and slip them under the door during designated times. He would respond the same way. Direct interaction would be limited to one supervised meeting per day, always with me in a salt circle and my eyes closed. The schedule showed my next movement window wasn't for 3 hours. I spent those hours testing every possible escape route. The heating vent in this room was too small to crawl through. The door hinges were on the outside, impossible to remove. I tried prying at the window boards with my fingernails, accomplishing nothing but bloody cuticles. The walls were solid plaster, no hollow spots where I might break through to another room. When my next movement window arrived, I ventured to the kitchen for lunch supplies. Ethan had reorganized everything. Sharp objects were locked away. The gas to the stove was shut off. Even the refrigerator had a padlock, with only certain shelves accessible during my time slots. I grabbed what I could and noticed something interesting. He'd installed a baby monitor on the counter, probably to listen for any escape attempts. That afternoon, I had my mandatory meeting with Ethan. I sat in the salt circle while he interrogated me about my energy levels, my understanding of psychic boundaries, my commitment to our new system. I gave him what he wanted, describing how much better I felt now that we'd established proper protections. I even suggested some improvements to his system, playing the eager convert. He seemed pleased but remained cautious. He informed me that he'd been documenting everything, creating a record of my previous attacks on his life force. If I ever tried to tell anyone about our arrangement, he had proof that I was the aggressor, the one who'd repeatedly violated his boundaries despite clear requests to stop. The videos, the written warnings, even signed statements from our parents acknowledging his condition and my refusal to respect it. I maintained my facade of understanding and agreement while my mind raced. He was right. To any outsider, his documentation would make me look like the unreasonable one, a sister who couldn't follow simple rules to accommodate her brother's needs. The boarded windows could be explained as necessary protection, the locks as reasonable precautions. I needed something more concrete if I wanted anyone to believe the truth. That evening, I discovered he'd modified the plumbing. The guest bathroom now only had cold water, and the shower shut off automatically after 3 minutes. Another energy-saving measure, he explained through a written note. Hot water was a luxury that interfered with proper psychic shielding. I shivered through my brief shower, adding it to my growing list of grievances. The second day brought new challenges. Ethan had apparently spent the night creating an elaborate testing system. He left various objects around the house during my movement windows, checking later to see if I'd touched them. Some were obvious traps, mirrors positioned to catch my reflection if I looked up. Others were more subtle, important items like my school notebooks placed just outside my approved pathways. I navigated carefully, touching nothing unnecessary. But during my afternoon kitchen visit, I made a crucial discovery. Behind the baby monitor, barely visible, was a small key. Not for any of the main locks. Too small for that. I palmed it quickly, my heart racing as I finished gathering food. Back in my room, I examined it carefully. It looked like a diary key, or maybe for a small lockbox. That night's mandatory meeting was more intense. Ethan had prepared a presentation about energy vampirism throughout history. He showed me printouts from his online forums, testimonials from others who'd suffered from psychic attacks, mirror helmets and movement schedules. Ethan's turning their home into the world's weirdest reality show where nobody wins and everyone needs therapy. This kid's got more rules than a board game nobody wants to play. He required me to read certain passages aloud, testing my commitment to understanding his worldview. I played along, asking questions that showed engagement while secretly memorizing every detail of his delusions. He revealed more about his plans for our future. Once our parents returned, he intended to present them with a formal contract. The house would be permanently divided. I would attend school online to minimize my exposure to others who might teach me predatory viewing habits. He'd already researched legal precedents for restraining orders based on psychic assault. If I didn't comply, he'd pursue official channels. I expressed concern about our parents' reaction, but he assured me they'd understand once they saw how much calmer he was with proper protections in place. He'd even prepared a demonstration, showing how his vital signs improved when I followed the rules versus when I deliberately looked at him. He had charts, graphs, medical documentation from sympathetic alternative healers. His delusion was becoming a comprehensive system. The third day, I found what the key unlocked. During my morning bathroom window, I noticed a small lockbox tucked behind the toilet tank. Inside were more disturbing finds. Printed emails between Ethan and various online communities, discussions about permanent solutions for energy vampires, links to medical supply websites where he'd purchased equipment. Most terrifying was a detailed timeline showing how long he'd been planning this week alone with me. I photographed everything with an old digital camera I found in the box, apparently forgotten from before he'd confiscated all devices. The battery was nearly dead, but I managed to document the most damning evidence. I hid the camera in my pillowcase, knowing I'd need to be extremely careful about when and how I used it. That afternoon, Ethan introduced a new element to our arrangement. He'd acquired some kind of electromagnetic field detector, convinced it could measure energy theft. During our meeting, he waved it around me, claiming he could see my aura's aggressive tendencies. When I suggested he scan himself for comparison, he became agitated. The device clearly showed abnormal readings around him too, but he insisted that was just his natural psychic shielding. I began incorporating this into my strategy. If he believed in electromagnetic fields, I could use that. I started asking about ways to cleanse my energy, to purify my aura. He eagerly provided information about grounding techniques, crystal healing, sage smudging. I took detailed notes, planning how to turn each belief against him. The fourth day brought a crisis. During my morning movement window, I discovered Ethan had been in my room overnight. Items were slightly displaced, and I found new locks installed on on the closet and dresser drawers. A note explained he'd detected aggressive energy building up in my space and had to take precautions. My hidden camera was still safe, but barely. More concerning was what I found in the kitchen. Medical supplies laid out on the counter. Bandages, antiseptic, even surgical tools still in sterile packaging. He'd left them during my window, clearly wanting me to see them. A reminder of his original plan, a threat that our current arrangement was conditional on my continued cooperation. I maintained my act during that day's meeting, but added a new element. I told him I'd been having dreams about energy transfer, visions of how our psychic connection worked. I described seeing threads of light between us, how his fear created dark tangles that trapped both our energies. He was fascinated, taking extensive notes as I spun an elaborate fantasy based on his own beliefs. This gave me an opening to suggest a cleansing ritual, something to reset our energy patterns and establish healthier boundaries. He was intrigued but suspicious. I insisted it would only work if we both participated fully, if we both truly wanted healing. I could see him wrestling with the idea, his paranoia battling against his desperate need to believe his worldview had solutions. That night, I prepared carefully. Using information from his own sources, I created an elaborate ritual design. Salt circles, candle positions, crystal arrangements, all drawn from the websites he'd shown me. But I added my own elements, psychological triggers I'd observed over the years, colors that had always agitated him, symbols that resembled things from his nightmares, patterns designed to create subtle discomfort. The fifth morning arrived with tension thick in the air. Our parents would return tomorrow evening. Ethan's behavior had become increasingly erratic, alternating between confidence in our new system and paranoia that I was planning something. He'd started leaving rambling notes about energy patterns he'd observed, complex theories about how my compliance might itself be a form of psychic attack. During my movement window, I found he'd completely rearranged the kitchen again. Everything was now organized by what he called energetic frequency. Foods were grouped by color and vibrational properties. He'd even created a chart showing which combinations would strengthen or weaken psychic shields. His delusion was expanding, becoming more elaborate by the hour. I used this to my advantage during our afternoon meeting. I praised his organizational system, suggesting we apply similar principles throughout the house. What if we created energy maps for each room? What if we could identify the exact spots where psychic vampirism was most likely to occur? He loved the idea, spending hours drawing elaborate floor plans marked with danger zones and safe passages. While he was distracted by his mapping project, I made my final preparations. I gathered the materials for my proposed cleansing ritual, carefully selecting items I knew would push his psychological buttons. I practiced my performance, the words I'd use to guide him through the process. Everything had to be perfect. This was my only chance. That evening, I proposed we perform the ritual tonight. I argued that our parents' return would disrupt the energy patterns we'd established. If we wanted to maintain our progress, we needed to solidify our psychic boundaries before they arrived. Ethan was hesitant, but I could see his curiosity winning over his caution. I spent hours setting up the ritual space in the living room, following his supervision while subtly incorporating my own elements. He insisted on checking everything against his sources, but I'd done my homework. Every detail could be justified by something from his beloved forums or books. He found no fault with my preparations, though I could see his unease growing. As midnight approached, we took our positions. I sat in my designated circle, eyes closed as always. Ethan stood in his own protected space, surrounded by mirrors and crystals. I began the ritual, speaking in the calm, hypnotic tone I'd practiced. I guided him through visualizations of energy flowing between us, describing how we could untangle the dark knots of fear and suspicion. I felt him relaxing, drawn into the narrative I was weaving. This was his language, his belief system, but I was using it to lead him somewhere new. I described how his protective barriers had become a prison, trapping his own energy as much as blocking others. I painted a picture of freedom through trust, of power through connection rather than isolation. The crucial moment came when I suggested we needed to make eye contact to complete the ritual, just once, with proper preparation and protection, to reset our entire energetic relationship. I felt his whole body tense. This was the ultimate test of whether I'd gained any real influence over his thinking. I continued talking, weaving together every piece of his mythology into a coherent argument for why this was necessary. I referenced specific posts from his forums, quoted his favorite energy healers, used every bit of terminology I'd absorbed. I promised that after this one moment of connection, I would never need to look at him again. Our energies would be properly balanced forever. The room fell silent except for our breathing. I kept my eyes closed, waiting. If he refused, I'd have to try another approach. But if he agreed, even for a moment, it might be enough to break through his delusion, or at least to document that he was capable of choosing to make eye contact, undermining his claims of life-threatening violation. Finally, I heard him shift position. He was considering it. I added one more element, suggesting we could use his electromagnetic field detector to monitor the energy exchange in real time. He could see for himself whether eye contact truly drained him, or if proper preparation made it safe. Science and mysticism combined, exactly the kind of thing he found irresistible. More silence. Then, incredibly, he agreed, but with conditions. Multiple protective circles, specific crystals positioned between us, and the session would last exactly 3 seconds. He spent another hour adding safeguards to my ritual setup, creating an elaborate fortress of protections around himself. As we prepared for the moment of connection, I felt my heart racing. This could go wrong in so many ways. He might panic and attack. He might have a complete breakdown, or nothing might change at all. But I had to try something, and this seemed like my best chance to either break his delusion or at least gain some psychological advantage. We synchronized our breathing as I'd suggested, creating what he believed was energetic harmony. I counted down slowly, building the anticipation. On 3, we would open our eyes simultaneously, look at each other for exactly 3 seconds, then close them again. I made sure the digital camera was positioned where it would capture the moment, hidden among the ritual supplies. The countdown finished. I opened my eyes. For the first time in years, I looked directly at my brother as he looked back at me. These ritual supplies and electromagnetic detectors make me wonder what Ethan really believes versus what he's using to control his sister. The surgical tools on the counter feel like such a calculated threat, not the action of someone truly lost in delusion. His eyes were wide with terror behind his protective goggles, but he held my gaze. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds. We both closed our eyes as agreed. Ethan immediately began hyperventilating, convinced he was dying. I stayed calm, guiding him through the sensations, reframing them as energy rebalancing rather than drainage. I described how I could see his aura aura strengthening, his natural shields adapting to healthy connection. Slowly, his breathing normalized. When he finally spoke, his voice was shaky, but amazed. He hadn't died. The protective measures had worked. Maybe, just maybe, there was a way to coexist without complete isolation. I carefully reinforced this new belief, praising his strength and wisdom in finding a solution. Inside, I felt a spark of hope. The crack in his delusion was widening. We spent the rest of the night discussing what this meant for our future arrangement. Ethan was still convinced that unprotected eye contact was dangerous, but now believed that proper precautions could allow for limited interaction. He started redesigning his system, incorporating scheduled eye contact sessions with elaborate safeguards. By dawn, he was exhausted but exhilarated. He discovered a new aspect of his condition, a way to manage it that didn't require complete isolation. I supported every wild theory, every elaborate protection scheme, knowing that each compromise weakened his absolute control. He was so focused on refining his new understanding that he forgot to lock me in that morning. I used the freedom carefully, not wanting to trigger his paranoia. I prepared breakfast for both of us, following all his dietary restrictions, but presenting it as a celebration of our breakthrough. He ate in the same room as me for the first time in years, though still wearing his mirrored helmet as a precaution. As our parents' return approached, Ethan's mood swung between excitement and anxiety. He wanted to share his discovery with them, to show how much progress we'd made, but he also feared they wouldn't understand the delicate balance we'd achieved. I volunteered to help him prepare a presentation, knowing this would give me influence over how the story was told. We spent the day creating charts and diagrams explaining our new system. I made sure to include subtle elements that would concern our parents, references to the medical supplies and restraints he'd prepared, mentions of the initial plan he'd abandoned thanks to our breakthrough. Ethan was too caught up in his enthusiasm to notice how damning some of the details were. As evening approached, we heard our parents' car in the driveway. Ethan panicked, suddenly unsure if he was ready. I assured him that everything would be fine, that they'd be proud of how we'd worked together to find a solution. I positioned myself carefully, ready to either support his presentation or expose the full truth, depending on how our parents reacted. The front door opened, and I heard Mom calling our names. Ethan looked at me, terror and hope warring in his expression behind his protective goggles. This was the moment that would determine everything. I gave him an encouraging nod, then walked with him toward the living room, ready for whatever came next. Our parents stood frozen in the doorway, taking in the bizarre scene. The boarded windows, the elaborate ritual setup still scattered across the floor, Ethan in his mirrored helmet, me emerging from what was clearly a controlled environment. Their expressions shifted from confusion to alarm as they began to process what they were seeing. Mom dropped her purse, keys clattering across the floor. Dad's mouth opened and closed without sound. I watched their faces cycle through emotions as they took in the boarded windows, the ritual circles drawn in salt, the mirrors positioned at strange angles throughout the room. Ethan shifted nervously beside me, his mirrored helmet catching the overhead light. Before anyone could speak, I moved quickly to the coffee table where Ethan had laid out his presentation materials. I grabbed the stack of papers and thrust them into Mom's hands. She fumbled with them, still too shocked to process what she was holding. Dad stepped forward, reaching for the light switch, illuminating more of the chaos. Ethan immediately retreated to his designated safe zone, a corner fortified with crystals and protective symbols. His hands shook as he adjusted his helmet, ensuring no direct line of sight existed between him and our parents. I watched him struggle with whether to explain or flee. Mom finally focused on the papers in her hands. Her face paled as she read Ethan's detailed documentation of my psychic attacks, complete with timestamps and elaborate theories about energy drainage. But I'd made sure to include other documents too. The medical supply receipts, the emails about permanent solutions for energy vampires, the timeline showing how long he'd been planning this week. Dad moved toward the boarded windows, running his hands along the boards. He tested their strength, then turned to examine the locks on the doors. His expression hardened as he began to understand the full scope of what had happened. He pulled out his phone, and I saw Ethan tense. I quickly explained that calling anyone would make things worse. I described how Ethan had created extensive documentation painting me as the aggressor, how any outside intervention would be twisted through his lens of psychic persecution, how we needed to handle this as a family first. Ethan began rocking in his corner, overwhelmed by the sudden intrusion into his carefully controlled environment. He started muttering about energy contamination, about how our parents' presence was disrupting the delicate balance we'd achieved. His breathing became rapid and shallow. Mom set down the papers and approached Ethan slowly, keeping her eyes averted as she'd learned to do. She spoke softly, asking if he was okay, if he needed anything, but her voice trembled with barely contained emotion. Dad stayed by the windows, methodically checking every board, every lock, cataloging the transformation of our home. I retrieved the hidden camera from where I'd stashed it during our ritual preparation. The battery had died, but I'd managed to document enough. I handed it to Dad, explaining what he'd find on it. His jaw clenched as he pocketed the device. Ethan noticed the exchange and began shouting about betrayal, about how I'd violated the sacred trust of our energy work. He accused me of planning this ambush, of using our parents as weapons against him. His agitation escalated rapidly, and he began pulling at his helmet straps. Mom tried to calm him, but her own composure was cracking. She kept glancing at the medical supplies still visible on the kitchen counter, at the restraints Ethan had mentioned in his documentation. The reality of what could have happened was sinking in. Dad finished his inspection and returned to the living room. He positioned himself between Ethan and me, a protective stance I hadn't seen since we were children. He began asking questions, his voice carefully controlled. When had this started? How long had I been locked in? What exactly had Ethan planned? I answered as factually as possible, describing the escalation from the eye contact rules to the imprisonment, the threats, the plan to blind me. I showed them my wrists, still marked from the restraints I'd worn during some of Ethan's energy repayment sessions. Mom gasped, reaching for me, but I stepped back. We weren't done yet. Ethan exploded at my accusations, insisting everything had been consensual, that I'd agreed to the new system. He frantically grabbed his charts and diagrams, trying to show our parents how the energy protection protocols worked. He explained his discovery about controlled eye contact, how we'd made breakthrough progress, but his explanations only made things worse. The more he talked about psychic vampirism and energy theft, the more our parents' faces reflected their growing horror. Dad pulled out his phone again, this time with determination. Ethan saw and panicked, knocking over his crystal arrangement as he lurched toward Dad. I intercepted him, using the de-escalation techniques I'd learned over the past week. I guided him back to his safe zone, speaking speaking in the calm tone that worked best. I reminded him about his breathing exercises, about grounding his energy. Slowly, his panic subsided into confused distress. Mom had found more of Ethan's documentation, including his plans for after their return, the contracts he'd prepared, the legal research about restraining orders, the proposals for permanently dividing the house. She sank onto the couch, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she was reading. Dad made several phone calls, speaking quietly but urgently. I heard him mention psychiatric evaluation, emergency intervention, immediate assessment. Ethan heard too and began building a barrier around himself using furniture and his protective materials. He announced he was sealing his energy field against all intrusions. The next hours blurred together in a chaos of activity. Dad worked to remove the boards from windows while Mom tried to keep Ethan calm. I stayed in the middle, translating between Ethan's energy language and our parents' desperate attempts to understand. Every interaction required careful navigation of his delusions. Ethan's resistance intensified as he realized our parents weren't accepting his worldview. He accused them of being corrupted by my influence, of choosing to murder him rather than respect his boundaries. He threatened to report them for elder abuse, even though he wasn't elderly, because denying his energy needs was a form of violence. When the first responders arrived, Ethan barricaded himself more thoroughly. He'd prepared for this possibility, creating what he called an energy fortress. The professionals who came were experienced with mental health crises, approaching slowly and speaking calmly. Ethan's energy fortress meets the real world, and suddenly his crystal collection looks less like protection and more like evidence. Nothing says family reunion quite like explaining why the living room has been turned into a supernatural panic room with mood lighting, but Ethan saw them as agents of psychic warfare. I provided crucial translation, explaining Ethan's belief system to the responders. I told them about the eye contact rules, the energy vampire mythology, the elaborate protections he built. They listened carefully, adjusting their approach based on the information. One of them had dealt with similar delusions before. The negotiation took hours. Ethan refused to leave his fortress, convinced that stepping outside his protections would mean instant death from energy drainage. The responders patiently worked to find compromises, ways to maintain his sense of safety while getting him the help he needed. Finally, they agreed to let Ethan wear his mirrored helmet during transport. He could bring certain protective crystals. They would minimize direct eye contact. These concessions felt absurd, but they were necessary to avoid a violent confrontation that would only reinforce his persecution beliefs. Mom rode with Ethan in the emergency vehicle while Dad and I followed in the car. The house felt strange without Ethan's presence, like waking from a long, disturbing dream. Dad gripped the steering wheel tightly, processing everything that had happened. Neither of us spoke during the drive. At the psychiatric facility, Ethan was admitted for evaluation. The intake process was challenging, with Ethan insisting on various protections and accommodations, but the staff was professional and patient, clearly experienced with delusional patients. They assured us he would be safe and properly assessed. The doctor who spoke with us afterward was direct but compassionate. Ethan appeared to be experiencing a severe delusional disorder, possibly with underlying conditions that had gone undiagnosed. The belief system about energy vampires had given structure to deeper anxieties and fears. Treatment would be complex and lengthy. Mom broke down completely then, sobbing about how she'd enabled him, how she'd thought it was just harmless eccentricity. Dad held her, his own eyes wet. I sat apart, feeling strangely numb. The past week had exhausted every emotional reserve I had. We spent hours providing information for Ethan's treatment team, his history of isolation, the progression of his beliefs, the escalation to violence. I showed them the photos from the hidden camera, the documentation of his plans. Every detail might help them understand and treat him. As we left the facility, I looked back at the building where Ethan would stay. For the first time in years, I could walk with my eyes open, seeing everything clearly. The morning sun felt warm on my face. I didn't have to navigate blind anymore. The drive home was silent, but it was a different kind of silence than before. Not the tense quiet of managing Ethan's rules, but the exhausted peace that comes after a storm finally passes. Thanks for letting me wonder alongside you. It's been genuinely interesting sharing all these thoughts together. Until we meet again, subscribe for more content like this.